In the past few months, we've spoken to Canadian scientists who are fearful of losing funding because of the new American administration that seems to be cutting research in particularly harmful ways. Studies involving women, gender, and racism have lost their funding from the National Institutes of Health, and often those studies are being done cross-border in collaboration with Canadian universities or institutions. Then I recently read an article in The Conversation about something else that's happening as a result of the American turn away from science, and that is anti-trans legislation that ignores the knowledge we've accumulated over the years and seeks to target some of the most vulnerable people in the country. And that is what we're going to talk about today. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. We've spoken on this podcast before about anti-trans legislation and the push to sideline the scientists doing work in the sex and gender space, but we've always done so from a Canadian perspective. I was curious to know how American psychologists are feeling at the moment, and so when I read the article, The Psychology Behind Anti-Trans Legislation, How Cognitive Biases Shape Thoughts and Policy, I reached out to the authors in Iowa.
I am Julia Standefer. I am a PhD student at Iowa State University.
I'm Alison Phillips, and I'm a full professor of psychology at Iowa State University. Yeah, we're both in the social psychology area.
That's right.
I wanted to talk to you guys because of an article you wrote in The Conversation about, well, one of the thousands of terrible things that seem to be happening in the U.S. right now. And I think a lot of the time we think about things like, oh, why are we focusing on that when this thing's also happening and that's also terrible and this other thing? And, I think in a way we kind of have to focus on everything. And I'm glad that we're choosing transgender issues to focus on here. But before we start with that, I just want to know what it's like right now to be a professor, a grad student in the United States in the current climate.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It's probably less for me as a grad student. But I mean, like I TA a class, I teach undergrads, and, we are not allowed to ask for undergrads' pronouns, for example. We have to be careful about doing that because we don't want to infringe upon these anti-DEI, anti-gender ideology policies that are coming down that we don't really fully understand. So there's kind of an air of fear about that.
And what would be the consequence if you did ask for an undergrad's pronouns and then referred to them using those pronouns as you would want to do?
Who's to say? Some may or may not have done it anyway and not faced consequences. But just in general, the university is afraid, I think, of losing funding, probably. People could maybe lose their jobs. I'm not sure. There's varying levels of how afraid people are of it. But that's the general.
And I would say on my end, similar. I'm, terrified for everyone involved, less so for myself, although it feels like walking on eggshells, what we can and cannot say. And we can teach on topics we can only state things that are germane to the content of the course. Those are the words drilled into us, which I understand. But anyhow, it feels like walking on eggshells. And being in psychology, it does feel like everything that we teach is now a political statement, and that's hard to navigate because we are not allowed to engage in political advocacy on the working dime and in the classroom. So it's hard to think about, well, how do I teach what I need to teach if it's so political? And right. Maybe other professions have had to deal with this before, but I don't think quite like this. So everyone's afraid. But as a professor, I'm in a less vulnerable situation in general. Although working for the state, it's, also tenable in some ways. But I feel protective is where I'm going. So I'm terrified, but largely on behalf of others. And so mostly what I think terrified Julia and me is not saying anything. So we wrote the Conversation article to speak out because we think that there needs to be a counter voice to negative things that might be happening. And so we're afraid of lots of things, but I think that's also why we started speaking out, that there are this is our job. We teach on social psychology and we research social psychology, and we know a lot of things are going wrong. And here are the things we can talk about.
Right. Well, and that sort of seems to me to be the place where, and even here in Canada, we're having people say the same things, which is, teaching about gender, teaching about things that you do know a lot about, now has become political in a way that I don't think anyone thought of it ever being before, right? It's biological, it's science, it's the realm of medicine and the realm of psychology and the realm of research. And at no point has that ever been political, but now there's something that has been so politicized about it. And that's one of the things you're writing about in the conversation piece is this idea that it's almost been weaponized, I think, as a culture divisive issue that I'm not sure people saw coming even a decade ago.
You mean the transgender?
Yes, specifically that, right? I mean, it's targeting such a small number of people and is blown out in such a huge, out of proportion in a way that, and I think that it's because, and we see it here in Canada too, people are targeting this particular issue and targeting this group of people because they think somehow it is a winning social issue, when I'm not sure that's even the case.
Yeah, I think that kind of gets to what we talk about a bit in the article too, is like it's very easy to weaponize that feeling of the other to be afraid of. And I think historically when we look at like the last 10 years, like before there was attacks on trans people, there were attacks on gay people and gay marriage. But I think, once same-sex marriage became legalized, they needed a new target. So it's my personal opinion that the trans community kind of just took that target, that kind of shifted over as a new community to be the out group to galvanize people in it for a political gain.
Yeah, and you guys talk a lot about the in-group and out-group ideas and how people perceive these things and how people are more likely to be afraid of the out-group and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of walk me through the process, the thought process you had in writing this article. It seems like you're trying to be sensitive to the people who are exhibiting this kind of bigotry and saying, we understand where you came to this.
We discussed our target audience for this article quite a lot and landed on people who we think are reasonable and well-meaning and well-intentioned, but have been misguided by these fundamental processes that we all go through in interpreting our world and judging people and how to interact with them. And so it was carefully written to say, hey, we all fall prey to these biases. Here's how they may have specifically led you astray recently, right? And so it was about general processes, but yeah, it was aimed at lawmakers who are writing and passing these anti-trans laws that are quite harmful, but not doing anything inherently evil. It's just these are natural human processes, and when made aware of them, hopefully by something like an article, could change their minds and kind of correct any misdirections.
Well, and that's the part that I found a little bit hard to follow in a way, because I'll give you an example. Here in Canada, in New Brunswick, we had a conservative government in New Brunswick who instituted a law that banned the use of preferred pronouns or changing names for any child in school under the age of 16. You had to have parental consent and all these kind of things, which a lot of advocates, of course, said is very harmful, right? A lot of kids aren't going to want to tell their parents at the age of 14 or 15, but they can come out at school. It's a more friendly environment with their friends, and there's a more supportive. And in order to get that law passed, first of all, they cited a psychological study where the authors had to come out and say, that's not what our study said at all. That's actually completely false. And they had to bring in a psychologist from somewhere in the United States to be the person who explained this, how, this is obviously harmful and child abuse and all this kind of thing. because they couldn't find anyone in New Brunswick who would say this. Right. And so they're passing a law that I think they have to know is harmful to children. Now, it's since been repealed. The government's changed in the province, and they've changed the law, and it's a lot more friendly now. But, the lawmakers' process to me feels like it isn't an issue of them not having enough information. It's an issue of them specifically seeking out the information that's going to confirm the thing that they already want to do because they believe their constituents want this.
And they believe it themselves. I mean, confirmation bias is extremely powerful.
We get into that too. It's so natural to, once you have a belief, only seek out information that agrees with you, basically. When if you're reading an article that has both points to and against what you believe, you can kind of mentally filter out, not really attend to the things that disagree with you, and only kind of pick up the parts that agree with what you already believe, because that feels better. And we like to avoid having to hold that dissonance in our minds of, oh, maybe I was wrong, maybe I should correct my belief. It's so much easier to just say, oh, this agrees with me, this agrees with me, and to go further and further down that same belief.
And I mean, you said that they must have knowingly written these laws to be harmful. And I think that cannot possibly be true. But what comes to mind is actually an example my husband brought to me. Was reading I don't know if it was a book or just an interview by a former CIA spy who worked in the Middle East of the world and was talking about the terrorist groups there whom she got to know. And the title was "Everyone Thinks They're the Good Guy," and firmly believe they're the good guy. And it's just completely opposite views of something, but that both parties think that they're the good guy, and through confirmation bias will hold that. And it's just frightening where that can lead. And we're just seeing the focus is on anti-trans, but as we've been discussing, we're having a hard time identifying exactly what's super special about transgender people that would explain this current focus. I think they're just the current scapegoat, and they're being used as a way of telling constituents, hey, I'm going to fix the problem. The problem is transgender people. And possibly that's more, they're better able to do that because there are few of them, right? It's a small group, and they're salient. They catch the attention. And so we've talked about how they might be threatening to people's personal identities and group identities. And there's a lot more to this. It's complicated, but I also think simply they're a scapegoat because they're a useful other group. They're easy to other. And we are having a lot of societal and global problems right now that lawmakers might rely on scapegoats to kind of address, or to at least assuage the fears of their constituents and be like, well, we'll fix this. Or it's like a distraction, let's focus on this problem over here, and then you won't notice all the other things that are going wrong. Yeah, it's a complicated problem, and I think we've probably lost the plot for you.
No, I think that makes sense. And actually, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the complexities of the problem. You mentioned a couple of lawmakers in the United States who are transgender and who were able to convince their colleagues to vote in a reasonably sensible way that protected trans youth. And that's, I presume, because they actually know those people. They interact with those people. And I wonder if you think that one of the reasons that transgender people seem to be such an easy outgroup to target is because most of the people who agree with this targeting don't actually know somebody, or are not aware that someone they know is in fact transgender or non-binary or gender non-conforming in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's, like we said, it's such a small population. It's like, give or take 1% of the population is gender nonconforming in some way. And so, yeah, a lot of people would have just never met, at least not to their knowledge, not met anybody who is transgender or non-binary or anything like that. And so the only picture they have in their mind of what these people are like is the story that is told to them. And so as we're seeing this story of a very vilified representation of trans people from the media, from politicians, what have you, it's very easy to kind of get that in your head. And then if you ever do have a one-off interaction, that confirmation bias comes into play again, where you only pick up the parts that go along with what you already believed. And you're not going to see a news story about breaking news, trans woman is completely normal and goes about her day.
Right.
You see breaking news, trans woman does something, and then people go, oh, that must be representative of this entire group of people, and that's just stereotyping. So
right. And I think too that you mentioned earlier, right, that the precursor to this was anti-gay propaganda and anti-gay marriage and this sort of thing. And some of the similar accusations are lobbed now that were lobbed then, only at a different group. And I think one of the easiest things to capture people's attention and then get them to rally behind a cause is when you say the words child abuse. That instinctively, every one of us, as you said, we all want to think we're the good guy, and we all want to think that we're going to do everything that we can to stop child abuse, to hamper the progress of abusers and that sort of thing. And so when you get told over and over again, well, this group of people is in fact abusing children, the data no longer matters, the facts no longer matter, anecdotal evidence becomes far more powerful, right? And I think that, though, at the very beginning was an intentional choice by some people to choose this line of attack.
And that might be possible. That paints a very scary picture of like the dastardly villain who's orchestrating these series of events. And I would rather feel that people are thinking they're the good guy. It is hard to see it that way sometimes. But yeah, what I want to point out is that emotions, we evolved to have emotions for survival, and they motivate behavior, right? That's the point of emotions, is to motivate our behavior, and they do it really well. And fear is probably the strongest. And so if you are afraid yourself, and this is where we could talk about identity threats and such, if you're afraid of transgender people because they threaten you somehow personally, that fear is what motivates you. And maybe that's what starts this process of convincing other people that, yeah, they're scary. And this is where our resources should be devoted right now, to anti-trans legislation. And maybe it's fear for your own identity, or it could, and then children just become, again, I say excuse because I'm not coming up with a better term, but just a focus for that persuasion campaign, right? Because it's so effective to talk about needing to protect children and fear for our children. We all feel that inherently. So it's just a very powerful persuasive technique. But like, what is the intention behind it? I can only point back to fear of some kind. And so we are, one of our goals is to counter that message and say like, no, this is a mistake. There are these natural processes. Let's be aware of them. We should not be afraid. This is false. Transgender people are not pedophiles by nature of being trans. They're not out to, making these changes to their own lives and accepting discrimination just so they can win sports. They're just trying to counter that message, but I think it's really the fear. So it might not work to use rationality and arguments and data, because emotions will drive our behavior even against rational arguments, right? So awareness, I guess we're aiming for awareness, but it's going to be a hard battle to win.
It will be tough, and maybe I'm more cynical than everyone else, and I see the bad stuff at the beginning. We were talking for a long time on this podcast about COVID disinformation, and the one thing that I just kept returning to was, you would see that diagram of the microchip that they're putting in you with the COVID vaccine, and no matter how many times people said, that's a diagram of a bass amp, like, that's very clearly a musical instrument. it didn't matter, right? It had made it around the world, and now we're being microchipped by this thing. And whoever did that in the first place had to do it intentionally. And so maybe that's why I'm thinking in those terms. But if it's an emotional response that's causing this, how do you appeal to the emotions of people to push back against it and to get them to be emotionally invested in the truth?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think when it comes to emotional responses to groups of people, that's where like personal connection comes in, that empathy for other people. Not everybody knows a trans person personally, and so entering space, like listening to trans voices or voices from any group that you're talking about in this kind of situation. If you can't meet someone personally and just become friends with them, see that, oh, this is just a human being just living their life in a way that's maybe different from the way I live my life, or going online and hearing those voices of people speaking just about their own experiences, I think, at least I hope, can foster that kind of that empathy and assuage some of that fear.
It does kind of put the onus onto trans people, and we've already discussed how there are too few of them to be noticeable in a good way. And it does, in some ways, though, it's more effective for people who are not in that targeted group to speak out to their peers and say, hey, this is not right. And I think back to when I was in college at Grinnell College in Iowa in early 2000s. It was feminist movement things still, and it was talking about sexual harassment and what's more effective, a woman standing up and saying, hey, this sexual harassment is terrible, don't do it, or is it more effective for a man to say, hey guys, don't do it? And it's more effective if men are the ones speaking up to their peers, right? So we're trying a multi-pronged attack.
Yeah.
My vocabulary, we're not attacking, we're presenting information, but from a trans person's perspective, as a human being, making it personal, as the representatives did in Montana, and then as an ally, just trying to make it more human and appealing to emotions in a way, looking for that empathy, because I don't think you can have empathy without some level of emotion. So that's fighting emotion with emotion. There's all sorts of persuasion techniques we could use. Right now, we're just trying to be heard, and it's just, we feel like we're just starting. But that's another reason why we tried to paint this as a broader picture of processes. This is not new. Historically, this has happened time and again. And so just pointing it out again with the hope that other people will make the connection. It's like, oh, wait, it's not really transgender people who are so threatening. We're scared and we're being distracted by this, and what's really going on, what really matters. So just hoping that people become aware themselves, and we assume we're speaking to well-intentioned, rational people. And so even if they were originally driven by an emotion, that we're assuming they can recognize that and counter it themselves. Because as Julia was saying, we all have these biases, and we have to recognize them and actively counter them every day. So we all have to do this. We all can do this, but we have to put effort into it.
Kind of make the choice, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think there's something too to this. Right? When the words child abuse come up, and then that makes you emotionally invested immediately, and safety of children is the paramount thing. I think there's a good argument to be made on an emotional level that the safety of children comes from their ability to tell their parents, I'm questioning this, ability to tell somebody at school, I feel like something's happening with me. I feel like I'm a little bit different than, I've been portrayed so far. To go to a doctor, a psychologist, right? And be able to have that conversation with your peers even. And are you worried that's going to become more and more difficult even than it is today?
What are you identifying as making it more difficult?
Just I mean, you cited a lot of the laws that sort of prevent this from happening. Julia, you were saying you're afraid to even ask for the pronouns of undergrad students at school because all of a sudden there's some sort of actual consequence that could take place as a result of this. It feels like there's only up to go from here, but I also don't live in the States.
Julie and I have talked about gender dysphoria, and I didn't know if you wanted to bring up this point, but how it's worse when we have legislation that prohibits people from even having this discussion with others.
And when you think of children who are coming to terms with their identity, and we know in a clinical sense, when it comes to gender dysphoria, that the best way to kind of alleviate the negative feelings that come with that is to, live more true to the self. And that's not exclusive to transgender people. That's in general. It's great to be yourself. I think anybody who's tried it could tell you that. And so, but we're specifically focusing on trans people here, and the legislation is as well. But when you have these laws that stop children or anybody from living how they would like to live, it leads to depression, a lot of negative psychological effects, and it's not a good thing. And so, we'd like to see it not get worse, and I like to think that it will get better. Maybe not instantly, but by changing minds and getting the general population's views to be more understanding and more accepting, then governments generally, in theory, will follow their constituents' lead on things like that.
But I will just say, I'm agreeing with you, Eric, that the legislation is working to silence people's voices, but also make those conversations more frightening, right? They're already scary enough in the current culture. It's to be gender fluid is still unusual for most people, right? It's not something that would be easy for children to discuss with their parents. But now, if there are laws against it, and I mean, some of these laws in various United States, I'm not sure about the laws being proposed in Canada, so maybe you know better, but some of them are very extreme. And I mean, in Iowa, we started out by talking in the article about removing human rights from a whole group of people. That's frightening enough, but gender affirming care being prohibited federally and in the United States, and just it solidifies the beliefs for people who don't know anyone who is trans and for whom this is not a personal issue. Well, it's a law, it must be bad. So it's furthering the misinformation, just having this legislation. But for the children themselves who are trans, for example, or gay, or somehow non-conforming, it makes it harder to have that conversation for sure. So I'm agreeing with you. I also agree with Julia that we hopefully can continue having these conversations and aim for empathy and hope that most parents are safe people that their children can have this conversation with. But if not parents, other trusted adults. And so right. I get upset when educators or librarians or counselors, there's too few counselors, where we're dictated to what we can and cannot say, and it makes it even harder for children to seek out other trusted adults.
Yeah, you mentioned parents, and there are a couple of provinces in Canada where they have banned gender affirming care, and they've gone pretty far with it. And it's always couched in this idea of parental rights, right? You have to have your parents' permission for this, which I think that, I feel like that's sort of a red herring thing, and it sounds good. Yes, parents should definitely have all the rights, but I think it misses the point that for so many kids, if you're questioning your gender identity, if you're questioning your sexuality, right, the most important relationship you have in your life is with your parents. And so to risk that relationship by telling them this it is unlikely you're going to go to them first. You're going to go somewhere else first. You're going to talk to peers first. You're going to talk to a trusted adult at school whose relationship doesn't, dictate the way your life is going to go. And parents may sometimes be the last resort. And I think parents sometimes have a hard time hearing that. I certainly did when my daughter came to us after talking to a bunch of people saying, okay, yes, I'm actually a girl. Well, okay, I would have been fine with that if you'd come to me first, but she still couldn't risk that. It was something that, other people were much better for the first go, right? And so I think in Canada, though, the difference is that it isn't a winning political issue. The majority of Canadians believe in gender affirming care. And yes, some provinces are far more supportive than others. So Alberta, we still have some of these laws on the books, but they were repealed in New Brunswick because people in New Brunswick, by and large, support gender affirming care over a fear of transgender people, I think.
We were also talking about misunderstanding of gender affirming care and trans people in sports and use of bathrooms, like all the specific issues that become the focus of legislation, the legislation that's not broad wielding, and how the fear comes from this unknown, right? The unknown aspects. And as you said, it's a misconception of what the threat is. And so just like, what is gender affirming care? And just seeing gender as a continuum, that it's even possible for that to be. And really just having people question their fundamental assumptions and realize, hey, maybe it's more complicated than I thought, and giving them space to, or causing them to allow there to be space for complexity in just people's identities. And so what is gender affirming care? And that's often where the laws begin. And some people might focus on the cost of that, or it's protecting children, but just kind of providing arguments against those specific points is, I don't know how effective that is, but I think it's important for people to realize, like, hey, maybe you didn't see the whole picture. And so when you're forming these beliefs, consider these other things. Like gender affirming care is typically hormones and psychological, right? So there's medical and there's psychological treatments. They're commonly used treatments in other ways too. It's not something special and super scary. It's, I'm on hormone replacement because I'm a woman in my 40s. It's just,
right. Yeah.
Hello. And other people present more masculine, even if they're cis male. And other, people do procedures to be more feminine, even though they're cis women. And
right. And people take puberty blockers because of a precocious puberty that is going to help them, live a regular life and delay the onset of puberty until it's a reasonable time, right? That lots of these things exist outside of the realm of gender fluidity.
Right. And so if we can reduce parents' fears of these things, hopefully we can make them safer adults for children to speak to about it. Yeah, I guess I haven't spoken to many children on this topic. I don't know the data. But my hunch is you're right, that they should have trusted, safe adults and peers to have this conversation with. And the legislation does make that harder, especially if we're talking about legislation on what books librarians are allowed to check out to people, or what topics educators are allowed to cover in class. And, my children will not hear discussions of gender because it's been prohibited until after 6th grade, I think it is. And I'm forgetting the details, but we're making it harder to have these conversations for sure.
Yeah.
I think what you said too about parents wanting to be that first person that their kid goes to. I haven't heard it said like that before. I thought it was really nice. Like it makes sense that a child wouldn't want to risk their primary relationship, their first relationship, on something like this, even if they do trust their parent. That's a very important relationship, and it makes sense that a child might want to go to a teacher who, while is also somebody who makes them feel comfortable, is somebody that, if they spoil this relationship with this teacher, well, they're going to go to a different teacher next year. You don't just get to replace your parents if they don't react right. And also just sharing this personal news of being genderqueer, of being any kind of nonconforming, can be a very vulnerable thing. And so you want to, ideally, I would imagine, share that first with someone who you are very confident is going to be accepting, because you don't want to say this thing out loud for the first time and be met with ridicule or judgment or anything like that. And I think it can be difficult in terms of this, like making it illegal for teachers to talk about this thing and librarians. It can be difficult for parents to accept that their children going to somebody else first is not a reflection on them being a bad parent. It's just kind of the way things are. And so rather than needing to legislatively force the issue to be only allowed to be talked about in the home, maybe just let kids talk to who they want to talk to and give them that freedom to live.
Yes, and what we want to do then is broaden the pool of people who are accepting, who are easy to talk to, who are understanding of these situations, so that there are more people that those kids can go to. And articles like the one you guys wrote is a great step toward that. It's a great way to get the message out. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with me, and thanks for writing a great article.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to you, our listeners, for downloading, streaming, sharing, and reviewing today's episode. Go to the show notes for a link to Alison and Julia's article. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our editor and producer is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.